Hello, people. Welcome to another episode of Conspiracy 420. This is episode 78, and we are talking about a very strange conspiracy too. Even until today, people deny it, and that's the New York conspiracy of 1741. And this continue our Black History month, and this is a conspiracy show dedicated to Black history. What do you have for us, Mike?
Yeah, the conspiracy of 1741 is also known as the Slave Insurrection of 1741. Historians to this day, like you said, they kind of, don't agree exactly what happened here, what kind of conspiracy it was, or how in depth it was. Okay. When I get into this, you're going to see just how crazy this is. You also got to put... Yeah.
What's it like? Black people are a little more free, like in New York and stuff. They really didn't have that much slavery.
Well,
that's what I was finding this like a little. And you also have white people, poor white people that were helping the slaves.
Yeah. Well, what happened is by the time 1741, New York City was the second largest major city with slaves, with the most amount of slaves. So Charleston, South Carolina, I think, was the most. Okay, which I think I do mention that. And this was, we weren't America then. We were a British colony. Okay.
Yeah, this is years away from
and they did, this is many years away from that.
Yeah.
And many years away from the Civil War. Okay. But there were always slaves in New York. Okay. They've found over the years burial grounds in Manhattan and stuff like that. For slaves. In 1741, the boundary for New York City was Chambers Street.
Yeah.
Anything north of that, man, you were in like no man's land. There was nothing there, just wilderness. Okay. Wow. It wasn't a central park. There was nothing. Okay. So, it's the slaves in New York had probably a little more freedom than they had down south. Okay, but you had this kind of intermixing of slaves and poor whites and what was called indentured servants, which were usually Irish men or women that were just a notch above being slaves. They owed money to somebody, so they'd have to come work for them, and until they paid it off, and it took years for that. So you had all this going on, and of course you had free people of color, okay, and it just was like, and everybody was competing for work. So you had slaves that were doing the work that poor whites were doing. So you had this kind of animosity between the two. Okay, why would I pay a white guy, what I can get a black guy to do for half price, even if he's a slave? So you had this economic struggle going on in the city. And politicians, just like today, it's no different. They use these, angles to pin everybody up against each other to stay in power. Okay, and that was going on then. And there were slave insurrections in the past.
Yeah.
But let me get into this a little bit so you understand what I'm talking about. In 1741, Manhattan, like I said, had the second largest slave population of any city in the 13 colonies. The first was Charleston, South Carolina. Now, rumors of a conspiracy arose against a background of economic competition between poor whites and slaves.
Yeah.
Right. And also you had at that time, there was a very bad winter in 1741. And there was a war going on between Spain and England.
Yeah.
Okay. And it created a lot of anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish feeling in the city and throughout the whole British Empire, pretty much. Okay. There were slave revolts that year or around that time in South Carolina and also in St. John in the Caribbean that they were hearing about. Okay. So in March and April of 1741, there was a series of 13 fires that broke out in Lower Manhattan. The most serious one was at Fort George, which was at the very tip of Manhattan, lower half, and that's where the governor of New York lived.
Yeah.
It was a big fort. He had a big property in there. There was, I believe there was even a church next to it that was just for him, okay? And when they put it out, people were like, wait, this is arson. They knew somebody said it. And then another fire broke out not too long after that at a warehouse, and a slave was seen running from the fire. Okay, running from the scene. And then there was a 16-year-old Irish indentured servant named Mary Burton.
Yeah.
He got arrested in a case of stolen goods, okay, involving that. But she turned state witness. The lawyer in charge, who I'll get into, he got her to talk, okay? And she started testifying that there's this conspiracy going on between poor whites and blacks, okay, to basically burn down the city.
Yeah.
They were going to burn the city down and kill all the white men, okay, and then take all the white ladies for themselves, okay.
Haven't we heard this before?
Yeah, and then they would appoint a new governor themselves.
Actually,
okay?
that's a new king and governor.
Even a new king, right. So, I mean, it sounded outlandish, but people actually worried about this at the time, these things happening, okay? Remember, they're on the other ass end of the world from England. There ain't a lot of help. You got some troops here, but they were all, you got a war going on. You got to wonder, there wasn't much security.
You also got to think that the only weapon they really had, they couldn't get like a bunch of muskets. They probably just got, the only way they could do stuff was burning stuff down, start fires, and start chaos and confusion.
And it sounds silly. Oh, you're going to burn the city down? Yeah, Manhattan did burn a couple of times. Okay, Manhattan. I mean, you remember, like even in that movie Gangs of New York. That was the draft riots in 1863, and they burned most of Lower Manhattan was burnt down at that time. Yeah. So in the spring of 1741, fear had really gripped the city as these fires started to happen in uninhabited areas too. Okay, areas maybe north of Chambers, they were seeing the forest burn and things like that. Now, the suspected culprits included hundreds of slaves, free blacks, and poor whites. 172 of them were arrested and tried for conspiracy to burn the city and murder its white inhabitants. Now, in the end, 34 people were executed. They included 17 black men, 2 white men, and 2 white women were hanged, okay? And 13 black men were burnt at the stake, okay? And in a very eerie resemblance to the Salem witch trials, okay, of the previous century.
Dude, and some people got exiled too.
Right. Some people were thrown out. They were told never to come back, okay?
The bodies were sent back to Caribbean slave owners, and
that would happen. And
they were vicious.
to understand that, if you got sent to the Caribbean as a slave, it was not a good place.
No,
it was not good. Okay, now the bodies of 2 supposed ringleaders. One guy was named Caesar; he was a slave, and then there was a guy named John Hewson. And he was a white man, a cobbler, which I believe, if I remember my history, a cobbler is a shoemaker, right?
Yeah.
Okay. He was also a tavern keeper. All right, Rob, like you. Okay.
A bartender.
Exactly. Okay. And they were gibbeted at the end of the trial. Now, gibbeted is when you're hung in public, okay, and you're left there to hang, to make a message, to send a message, okay? And you basically stay there a while until you start rotting and no one can take it anymore, and they take you down, okay? Now, another 84 men and women faced deportation, okay, altogether, and 7 white men were actually pardoned, but they were pardoned under the condition that they would leave and never come back.
Never come back.
Right. Now, with the increase of enslaved Africans in New York City during the early decades of the 18th century, there were occasional slave revolts or fears of them happening. Yeah. Often what would happen is different political factions fan that flame of fear. Okay, they would say things like, oh, there's going to be a slave rebellion, and scare people into getting them to vote for them or things like that. Okay. Now, by 1741, slaves comprised as 1 in 5 of New York City's total population of 10,000 people. So you had 10,000 people living in New York City at the time. It seems like nothing now. That's like a couple of blocks now, you know what I mean? But in the whole city from Chambers Street down, 10,000 people, but 20% of them were slaves. That's a lot of slaves compared to people.
That's a lot of slaves, yeah.
So, on an average of every 2 to 3 years, you would hear about plots happening, okay, to have slave rebellions. So some New York City residents remembered in 1741 about the New York slave revolt of 1712. That was still kind of in the back of their minds. At that time, in 1712, 20 slaves met to destroy property and kill people in retaliation for how they were being treated. All right. Now, one slave called Kofi set fire to his master's outhouse. Okay. And when neighbors came to put it out, the slaves attacked the crowd
and killed
a bunch of people. Right, nine white people and injuring 6. The governor tried these men and executed 21 slaves altogether in that rebellion.
Think about 21 slaves.
Yeah, and they hung them probably.
Mike, you want to hear something funny? You notice that this got a little comparison to Return to the Planet of the Apes. Who was the head of the guy? Caesar.
Yeah.
I mean, Caesar, and there was a guy named Caesar. What is that name always? And like when you think about revolts or something, somebody named Caesar that leads the pack. How funny is that?
Yeah, I don't know, because it's just kind of like a warrior name, I guess.
I guess so.
Yeah, Julius Caesar. Yeah,
his name could have been Jimmy or whatever. I'm Caesar. It's pretty funny.
Take a warrior name if you got a choice.
Yeah. But so they freaking executed 21 slaves as savages.
Yeah, and that was just for burning down an outhouse and attacking a few people. Right,
so if anybody doesn't know what our house is, it's pretty much a bathroom.
It's a bathroom, an outside bathroom. Yes.
Yep.
For the young people out there. Now, with more slaves in New York at this time, poor whites had to compete harder economically. Some slaveholders were artisans or tradesmen themselves, and they would teach their slaves their trades. Okay, wow. Whatever it was, carpentry, whatever it was. And they could subcontract out their work and underbid the poor whites.
Yeah.
Okay. And this created, racial and economic tensions.
Yeah.
Okay. Between slaves and the white craftsmen that knew how to do the work. Okay. So many white people would lose their businesses over this procedure. Okay. So it was really just kind of like a recipe for disaster happening. Okay. And the winter of 1740 to 1741, like I said before, was very miserable. Food and fuel were hard to get. Temperatures were at record lows. and snowfall was at record highs. Okay, so it was really a miserable winter. Many people faced either freezing to death or starving to death as an option. All right, it really, if you didn't have any option. Yeah, it's just either way you're dead. It created a lot of resentfulness. People were resentful against each other. They were resentful against the government and who's in charge, and and people were sick and tired of it. Rumors again of a slave revolt were very high. Okay, in these kinds of times, they would hear about that, and you would understand why the slaves would want to revolt, because they weren't eating either. Okay, they were starving to death or freezing to death too. So to make matters worse, Britain and Spain were now increasing their hostilities, and it did cause that anti-Catholic sentiment. Prior to this, in 1691, the British Crown had basically ordered all New Yorkers to swear oaths under something called the Test Act. Okay, and the Test Act basically,
what was that?
They couldn't have any allegiance to the Pope. Okay, even if they wanted to practice Catholicism, they had to say that they didn't swear allegiance to the Pope. All right, and eventually there would be a straight up ban on Catholicism. You couldn't have a priest.
Yeah,
you couldn't have them. They couldn't exist in New York City. It's funny because you think that...
what? They would get, if you did have a priest, guess what? They would get life in preaching.
Yeah, right. If they found... If you were a priest practicing in New York City by 1741, you could go to jail forever.
Mike, I want to bring something up. And it's like a little kind of formation of like the KKK. They're like anti-Catholic, anti-this, anti-that. It's like a weird formation of some kind of, Ku Klux Klan kind of thing, if you think about it.
Yeah,
because when did the Klan come into power?
The late 1800s, after the Civil War.
Right after the Civil War.
Yeah,
but this thing sounds like you can see the roots of it, where they got some anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish.
Look, I mean, before there was even colonies, when the Europeans were just over in Europe, okay, they had these kinds of fights. There was the 30-year war between Protestants and Catholics.
Oh, yeah.
If there was something to fight about, the Europeans fought. They invented that shit, okay, as far as, fighting over stupid shit, ethnicities and religion. And, Henry VIII, you go back to the 1400s, Henry VIII was Catholic, right? But he wasn't... He wanted a divorce from one of his many wives. The Pope wouldn't let him have it because it's against Catholicism to get divorced. So what does he do? He starts his own church.
Yeah.
And then he just started cutting his wife's heads off, But, there's always been that kind of warfare, okay, and tensions, and it just followed over into the New World. 2 years prior, in 1739, actual war did break out between England and Spain. And again, a crazy subject. It was called the War of Jenkins' Ear.
Yeah, that was very weird.
And it was from 1739 to 1748. That's 9 years.
9 years.
Okay? And all it was that some Spanish ships, they boarded a merchant marine.
Robert.
His name was Robert Jenkins. Okay, and when they boarded his ship, they cut off his ear, and it started the war between the two countries. I mean, that's nuts, right?
That's crazy. That started a war just because they cut some dude's ear.
Somebody's ear off. He probably had it coming anyway. So, I mean, now at the time, Spain was viewed by slaves as a liberating country. Okay, there was a treaty from 1713 between England and Spain called the Treaty of Utrecht.
Yeah,
and what it was the British supplied the Spanish with an unlimited amount of slaves. okay, in return for 500 tons of goods every year. That's a lot of food
That
and
is a lot of
supplies.
food.
Okay, so the reason that they're seen as liberators is many, many times, if you were involved as a slave in this kind of trade, if you got traded to the Spanish, eventually you would be set free somewhere.
But I think you will have to join the army or serve them.
Yeah, you might have to. You're right. You might have to do something for that. They may say to you, serve 4 years in the Spanish Navy or whatever, and you're free.
And you're free.
Yeah.
Which
So
is not a bad deal.
Not a bad deal, considering, right?
Yeah.
Now, because of the war with Spain, the British planned to attack Cuba at some point. Okay, Cuba was a colony of Spain. Now, what they were going to do was they were going to use soldiers that were already stationed in New York City. And when they did that, it greatly reduced the amount of troops in New York City at the time, which had a lot, it had a lot of people concerned, okay, because they were worried about slave rebellion and other things.
So the troops were pretty much like the cops, right?
Well, they were troops. They were, redcoats.
Yeah, but did they have cops back then? Did they have like law enforcement?
Yes. Yeah, they were called constables.
Oh, constable. Okay.
Yeah. Now, in 1741, they decided to crack down a little bit with some laws because they were worried about slave rebellions. They said slaves, couldn't meet on street corners. 3 slaves could only be together at one time anywhere. If there was a funeral, only 12 were allowed to go at one time. There was
I think we still got rules like that in the law. No, you can't unlawful insemblage. What do you mean? You can't have a group of more than like 20, 30 people meeting somewhere without like a license or something. It's unlawful assembly.
Yeah. I mean,
assembly or unlawful gathering. It's weird stuff like that. It's weird law even to today in New York.
No, there's a lot of weird laws on the books in New York City that they just don't enforce anymore.
Yeah, they don't enforce.
They're still there. Yeah, I mean, if you have too many people, they may ask for a permit, or if it's a protest, you might have asked for a permit or be allowed to. May not cost you anything, but you still have to get the permission.
Yeah.
So anyway, the government, was basically trying to do what it could to stop people from being afraid of this possible slave rebellion. So there was also a problem of a lot of stolen goods going on, a lot of stealing going on, because there wasn't enough supplies to go around. And John Hewson's Tavern, okay, which was on the Hudson waterfront near Trinity Churchyard, if you could picture that, right there, not too far from the Trade Center. A lot of people were saying that he's dealing with stolen goods. So the city council decided to investigate this, okay? And also the neighbors didn't like him because he served kind of like, scummy people, okay? He also had like slaves could meet there and he would serve them, which was weren't supposed to do that, okay? You weren't allowed to serve slaves alcohol, okay?
Wow.
Poor whites met there, free blacks met there, and soldiers hung out there too. All right. Now, cops for a while started, or I should say constables, they weren't cops. They started watching him, and at first they couldn't find anything. He was very slick.
Yeah.
But at one point, in February of 1741, they did catch him for receiving stolen goods from Caesar, the slave. Okay. Okay. And there was also another slave named Prince. Okay. And a third slave named Coffee. These 3 guys, okay, Caesar, Prince, and Coffee, were part of what was called the Geneva Club. Okay. And they were called that because they had been busted once before for stealing Geneva gin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gin.
Yeah, and they actually like were whipped, I think, in a public square or something for it. Okay.
Yeah, imagine that they just whip you like savages.
Yeah, just right out in the open. I know.
Oh.
It's crazy. So there was a guy named Daniel Horsmaden. He was the main city judicial officer appointed by the British. And one of the three justices in the court, and then a leader of the investigation, pressured a 16-year-old indentured servant named Mary Burton. Okay. She testified against her master, which was John Hewson. Okay. She was they were able to flip her, get her to talk, and basically said, yeah, he's receiving stolen goods. During the grand jury for this, when the grand jury was hearing the case, 13 fires broke out in the city, very suspiciously, while the grand jury was going on. Now, keep in mind, this was in the papers. It was a big thing starting. Okay. Wow. So on March 18th, 1741.
The day after St. Patty's.
Yep. And they did celebrate it that time. They did. Yep. That's how old it is. Yep.
And they just started fires.
People didn't like the Irish too much either, believe me. On March 18th, 1741, Governor George Clark's house in Fort George caught fire. Soon there was a connecting church on the property that caught fire as well. And they were able to save like some documents of the city and stuff like that was kept there. Eventually, these documents would all be kept in City Hall. But at that time, they were kept in the governor's mansion there. Okay. Now, a week later, more fires broke out near City Hall, but they were kind of put out quickly. After that, more fires increased, and a lot of arson was going on in different places. In a radical kind of attempt to control the situation, 100 slaves were jailed. And basically, they did that to try to control any kind of uprising. They didn't think 100 people were involved with it, but they just jailed 100 of them in a sweeping move.
But you got to think there were probably more than 100 people involved with this. They were like almost tactical fire.
Well, when I get into the numbers, you're going to see what happened here. Okay, Horsmaden, the prosecuting attorney, put a lot of pressure on Mary Burton to talk about the fires. And she swore that members of the Geneva Club used to meet frequently at Hewson's home. She said that they, Hewson and them discussed burning the city. Okay. Now, another woman named Margaret Sorobero, she's got a couple of names. Margaret Sorobero, also known as Salenberg, also known as Kerry, also known as first name Peggy, or she was known as the Newfoundland Irish Beauty. Okay, she was implicated by Mary Burton for arson. Okay, now this woman, we're going to call her Peggy. She was a prostitute.
And she served black guys.
Yes. She specialized servicing free black men, okay, and slaves. And the room she lived in was paid for by Caesar the slave.
Wow.
Okay. And she had a child with him too. Okay. She was his baby mama.
This guy Caesar was getting around.
He was getting around, and he was a slave.
He was a slave.
So Mary Burton's testimony didn't prove that any crime had been committed. The grand jury was so afraid, though, of more fires occurring that they decided to believe her. Okay?
Wow.
I mean, she was just saying this. There was no proof. Okay? It was hearsay. So the lieutenant governor, jumped the gun again and issued a proclamation offering rewards to anyone providing info on who set these fires. And there were financial compensations for this. 100 pounds went to any white person, 45 pounds to any free black person or an Indian, and 20 pounds and freedom would go to a slave if he could provide information. So such prices, I mean, at that time, people would go like, yeah, I know something. Okay, I know something. You just go down there and line up. Okay, so on May 2nd, the court the court found Caesar and Prince guilty and gave them the death penalty. Okay, the next day after that, 7 more barns caught fire.
Wow!
And 2 black men were caught, and there was no trial. They just were burned at the stake. Okay.
That was the basic shit back then. If they catch you, they didn't need it.
Well, it was street justice, man.
It was street justice.
Yep.
Just take them to the corner.
Yep. Just burn them at the stake. How horrible is that, man?
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah. So on May 6th, the Houstons and Peggy, the prostitute, were found guilty of burglary charges. When I say the Houstons, I believe it was John and maybe his wife, or I'm not really sure. But some blacks had actually been imprisoned in dungeons, and they were starting to talk. Okay, when they heard about the rewards. On May 11th, Caesar and Prince were both hanged.
Because they didn't talk. They kept their mouth shut.
They kept their mouth shut. Okay, but after gathering much more information now, Horsman started more trials. There was just one after another related to this, different offshoots. And Coffee and another slave named Quacko were the first to be tried.
That's a great name, Coffee and Quacko.
Coffee and Quacko. I know. It's like, yeah, I mean, you think like Columbo or something would know these.
Yeah.
So these 2 were the first to be tried. And they actually had their masters speak for them, which was in those days, if you were a slave and your master spoke for you on trial highly of you, you usually got off, okay, for whatever you were being charged. Didn't work in this time, though.
Yeah, they were just throwing them in jail, man.
Yeah, I mean, they were throwing the book at everybody. Before, I should say, but before these 2 guys were to be hung, Quacko and Coffee, they decided to talk. Okay. And they basically named about a dozen more co-conspirators to the fires and the planned slave rebellion and all these things.
Wow.
Okay. So more trials followed.
And more hanging and more stake burning.
Yes. Right. And the Houstons and the prostitute Peggy were tried on June 4th, and they were found guilty and sentenced to hang 8 days later. Now, at the height of the hysteria that summer, half of the city's slaves over the age of 16 were implicated in the plot or jailed. The epidemic of mutual incrimination became so extensive that the courts were closed for the rest of the year. In other words, everybody was ratting everybody out, and they just couldn't keep up with it. Okay, and some of it was just because they were going to hang you, they were going to execute you, or if you wanted the reward money. So everybody was just angling for themselves, okay, and everybody was getting locked up because of it. The jails
and there was hanging in the summer. It was like all summer long. There was just
hanging people like crazy, okay. So then Horsmandin, the head lawyer, he decides to take a twist on this, and he tries to link Catholics with the fires. So now he's not only just after, the slave population or maybe poor whites that are doing this. He's now going after any Catholic person. Okay, doesn't matter. And Mary Burton was brought in again because all of a sudden she remembered, okay? She remembered that a man named John Urry was a plotter as well, okay? And she testified against him. And she accused Urry of being a Catholic priest, which would have been a death sentence, okay? So he admitted that he was not a religious man. He was away from the Church of England. He didn't practice, okay? But he said he was not a priest, and he didn't know anything about the conspiracy. So Horsmanden also claimed that he had a letter from the governor of Georgia named James Oglethorpe. I believe Oglethorpe founded the colony of Georgia, okay? He was still the governor. And he wrote a letter to, supposedly he had a letter from him saying that Spanish agents were planning to invade, and create chaos in the British colonies, okay? And this created further hysteria, okay, among, not just in New York and other places. And in that action, John Urry was convicted. The guy wasn't even a priest. Okay,
yeah, he wasn't even a priest.
In the hysteria of it all, he was convicted. And after that, the fears kind of started to die down a little bit. Things had kind of ran their course. Mary Burton started to take it a little too far. Okay, and Horsmaiden, because after the Catholic priest thing.
You think this lady just started getting back to people that just didn't follow her?
I think she was just full of shit.
Oh, so you think she was just?
I think she was just. Yeah, I mean, it may have been some truth, but I think she embellished quite a bit. Okay,
maybe she was banging the prosecutor, say, "Hey, I want this guy out, I want that guy out." Who
maybe.
The fuck knows?
Well, you'll see what it is too, because when I get into it here, okay, now. What Mary Burton started to do was blame the upper class. She started to blame certain people in the white upper class of being co-conspirators. And that wasn't going to fly. So politicians and the city leaders started to put pressure to close the case, which eventually happened. By the end of the trials, 161 blacks and 20 whites had been arrested. From May 11th to August 29th, 1741, 17 blacks and 4 whites were convicted and hanged. 13 blacks were burned at the stake. 70 blacks were exiled forever from New York City. 7 whites were deported. And in 1742, here's the kicker, Mary Burton got her $100 reward from the city, which bought her freedom as an indentured servant. And she had some money left over. Okay, now tell me she did not do that for the money.
She did for her money and freedom.
Yeah, but how many people did she kill?
Savage.
Terrible. Yeah, now many of the executions were conducted near what was called the poorhouse at the north end of the city, which was Chambers Street. Now, north of there, like I said, was a wilderness, but there was an African burial ground right near there. And it was actually rediscovered in 1991 when they were building 26 Federal Plaza. Okay, I don't know if you remember that in the news.
I remember that.
Yeah. It's now a national landmark. Okay. But, it's a little interesting piece of New York City history. Sometimes you forget that there were slaves here, okay? A lot of the very old buildings in New York City were built by slaves, okay? You had the indentured servants also, okay? There's a dark past there, So I thought this was a kind of a cool story to bring up.
It's funny, the 3 women in here were like Mary Burton, Sarah Huginson, and Peggy Carey were women that whose testimony was interesting. The outcome of the trials
Right.
during the slavery revolt. So these people were also telling on each other after a while.
When there's money involved, right?
But two out of the three women got hanged.
Yeah. The only one that made it was Mary Burton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty incredible.
Yep. So that's all I got today, Mr. Rossi.
Even that guy, Earl, he got hanged. The school teacher.
Yeah.
Fucking savage. Imagine that every weekend you went to the poor city and what we see? Hangings. And that was like extravaganza. People stood around and watched that thing.
I mean, even in, you hear stories like in the Old West and stuff, hanging on a Sunday after church. It's like, oh, okay. All right, let's go check it out. I don't know. It's crazy.
Pretty funny.
Yeah.
So that's the first part of Black History Month, and it's the conspiracy, the New York conspiracy of 1741. And think about it. If it is a conspiracy, why, if you're a New Yorker, why would it want to bury this history? Like, that never happened. It didn't really, but it did happen. Where you got the record books.
It's almost like a perfect mix of truth and conspiracy, because a lot of these people were innocent, and they were obviously just being blamed so they would get paid. Okay. But then you did have people actually doing it. So there was a rebellion going on. It's just how big it was is not accurate, You know
what the funny thing, for all you know, that girl Mary could have been the ringleader, just trying
Who knows?
to people.
Yeah.
Who the hell knows?
Who the hell knows?
Especially in those times. Oh, you know what? I'm just gonna talk. So it's pretty interesting. So this is another fine episode of Conspiracy 420, episode 78. And we'll continue back history with the next episode, which will be 79. And who will talk about in the next episode?
Okay, we got a special one here. Marie Laveau. Okay, so, for anybody that's been to New Orleans, you definitely know who she is. She was the voodoo queen of the city in the 1800s. Interesting story we're going to have there. We talk about a little voodoo magic, things like that.
Yeah, we're mixing it up with rock shows. So we got 2 rock shows dedicated to Black history. We got Sun Ray and
Sun Ra.
And then we got Mal Davis. So Black history will be considered 2 rock shows and 2 conspiracy shows. So people, remember, if we don't see you this week, we'll see you next week. Okay. What do you want to say, Mike?
No, I was going to say, don't get drunk.
Get lumped up.
Okay, take care, people.
See you next week.